Julian appears unannounced at funeral. John Lennon's letter left mourners devastated. December 14th, 1980, New York City. There was no funeral for John Lennon. Yoko had decided against it. No public ceremony, no gathering of mourners, just a silent vigil in Central Park and private grief behind closed doors. But grief doesn't follow rules, and some people needed to say goodbye. The Dakota apartment building stood gray and imposing on 72nd Street. Its Gothic architecture casting shadows over the spot where John had been shot just 10 days earlier. The bloodstains had been washed away, but the horror remained. Inside apartment 72, a small private gathering was taking place. Yoko had permitted only the closest friends, the most trusted inner circle, people who understood that this wasn't a funeral. It was a quiet moment of remembrance before the world moved on. There was Elliot Mintz, John's publicist and friend, Bob Gruen, the photographer who'd captured John's final years, a handful of others who'd been part of John and Yoko's tight-knit New York life. They sat in the white room where John had spent his last years, the room with the piano where he'd written his final songs, the room with the window overlooking Central Park where he'd watched the seasons change. Nobody knew what to say. How do you eulogize a legend? How do you sum up a life that touched millions? Yoko sat in silence, her face pale and drawn. She hadn't slept since December 8th, hadn't eaten much, hadn't cried in front of anyone. She was holding an envelope, white, thick, sealed with wax. Nobody knew what was inside. At exactly 2:00 p.m., the doorbell rang. The doorman had strict instructions. No visitors, no press, no exceptions. But the doorbell rang again. Elliot went to answer it, ready to turn away whoever had managed to breach their security. He opened the door. Standing in the hallway, carrying a small duffel bag, wearing a black suit that looked slightly too big for him, was Julian Lennon. 17 years old, red-eyed from crying, jaw set with determination. "I'm here for my father," Julian said quietly. Elliot froze. Julian hadn't been invited. Nobody had told him about this gathering. He'd found out about his father's death from the television news, from a reporter's voice announcing that John Lennon had been shot, that the Beatle was dead. Not from Yoko, not from any family member, from the television. "Julian," Elliot said carefully, I don't care what you think," Julian interrupted, his voice shaking but firm. "I don't care that I wasn't invited. I don't care that Yoko doesn't want me here. He was my father, and I'm saying goodbye." He pushed past Elliot and walked into the apartment. The room full of mourners went silent. All eyes turned to the teenage boy standing in the doorway. John's first son, the one from the old life, the one who didn't quite fit into the carefully constructed narrative of John and Yoko's love story. Yoko stood up slowly. For a moment, nobody breathed. Then Yoko said, "You shouldn't be here." "Neither should he," Julian replied, his voice breaking. "He should still be alive. But here we are." The room remained frozen. Julian looked around at these people, strangers mostly, who'd been part of his father's final years while he'd been kept at a distance. "I came to say goodbye," Julian said. "That's all. I'll leave after. But I need to do this." Yoko stared at this boy, who looked so much like a young John. Same eyes, same defiant chin, same anger barely contained beneath a fragile surface. "You have 5 minutes," she said finally. Julian walked to the center of the room, where a photograph of John sat on a table. It was from 1980, John wearing his New York City t-shirt. Smiling, alive, Julian stood before his father's image, and everyone in that room watched as the boy they'd all forgotten about tried to find words for the unspeakable. "Hi, Dad," Julian whispered. "I came to tell you something. Something I should have said when you were alive." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. But it turns out, you wanted to tell me something too. That's when Yoko realized what Julian was holding. It was a letter. A letter from John. A letter nobody knew existed. And when Julian began to read it out loud, every person in that room understood that they were about to hear something that would change everything they thought they knew about John Lennon's final days. Julian's hand shook as he unfolded the paper. The handwriting was unmistakably John's, messy, urgent, written with the kind of intensity that came at 3 a.m. when thoughts wouldn't stop. "How did you get that?" Yoko asked, her voice sharp. Julian looked at her. "He sent it to me, 3 days before he died. I got it yesterday. It was forwarded from Mum's address in England." He looked back down at the letter. "I'm going to read it, because he wanted me to have it. And because all of you need to hear what he was really thinking in his final days." Nobody stopped him. Julian cleared his throat and began to read. "Dear Jules, it's 3 a.m. in New York and I can't sleep. Again. I've been thinking about you, about us, about all the years I wasted being scared. You're 17 now, almost a man, and I've missed most of it. I missed your childhood, your teenage years, all the moments that mattered. I told myself it was complicated, that you were better off without me, that Cynthia was giving you a better life than I ever could. But that was bullshit. The truth is, I was a coward. I was so terrified of being a bad father that I chose to be no father at all. And that's worse. That's so much worse." Julian's voice cracked, but he continued. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. About legacy. About what I'll leave behind when I'm gone. Everyone thinks it'll be the music, the songs, the Beatles, the peace activism. And yeah, that stuff matters. But you know what matters more? You. You're my legacy, Jules. Not Imagine, not Abbey Road. You. And I failed you." The room was silent except for Julian's voice. Yoko had sat back down. Her face was unreadable. "I know I've said this before. After that therapy session in '74, when you showed up unannounced, I promised I'd be better. And I was, for a while. I called. I visited. I tried. But these last few years, I disappeared again. I used Sean as an excuse. Told myself I was being a good father to him, finally getting it right with my second chance. But that's not fair to you. You deserved that same attention, that same effort. You deserved your father, and I gave you excuses instead." Julian paused, wiping his eyes. Nobody in the room moved. "Here's what I need you to know, son. What I need you to understand if something happens to me. And yeah, I've been thinking about mortality lately. Turning 40 does that to you. Makes you think about time running out. You were not a mistake. Your birth didn't trap me. My leaving had nothing to do with you, and everything to do with my own cowardice. You are my son, and I love you, and I'm sorry I've been so shit at showing it." The words hung in the air like smoke. Several people in the room were crying now. "I'm writing this letter because I had a dream last night. A nightmare, really. I dreamed I died without you knowing how I really felt. Without you understanding that every time I failed to show up, every missed birthday, every unanswered call, none of that was because you didn't matter. It was because I was broken, and I never learned how to fix myself properly." Julian's voice was barely a whisper now. "If you're reading this, something's happened to me. Maybe I'm dead. Fuck, that's morbid to write. Maybe I'm just too sick to tell you this in person. Whatever the reason, I need you to know these things. 1. You are loved. Always have been. Even when I was terrible at showing it. 2. You owe me nothing. Not forgiveness, not understanding, not even your grief. I failed you, and you don't have to pretend otherwise. 3. My love for you and my love for Sean are not in competition. You both deserved better than the father I was. 4. Yoko is not the villain. I know the press made her out to be. I know you probably blame her. Don't. I made my own choices. I chose to leave. I chose to disappear. That's on me, not her. 5. You're going to be okay. You're stronger than I ever was. You've survived having me as a father, which means you can survive anything. Julian stopped reading. His shoulders were shaking with silent sobs. The entire room was crying now. Even Yoko, tears streaming down her face. I don't know how to end this letter, Jules. There's so much more I want to say. So much I should have said years ago. I'm proud of you. I'm sorry. I love you. If I could go back and do it all differently, I would. I'd choose you every single time. I'd be the father you deserved from the start. But I can't go back. All I can do is tell you the truth now, and hope it means something. You were worth showing up for. I just wish I'd realized that sooner. Love, Dad. Julian folded the letter carefully and put it back in his pocket. Nobody spoke. The silence was broken only by the sound of people trying not to sob out loud. Finally, Yoko stood up and walked over to Julian. For a moment, they just looked at each other. The widow and the first son. Two people connected by the same complicated man. He meant it, Yoko said quietly. What he wrote. He talked about you all the time those last few weeks. Did he? Julian's voice was hollow. Yes, he was planning to call you, to visit. He wanted to do better, but he didn't. No, he didn't. He ran out of time. Julian looked at this woman his father had chosen. This woman the world blamed for breaking up the Beatles, for stealing John away from his first family. Did he love you more than me? The question came out before Julian could stop it. Yoko's answer surprised everyone. He loved us differently, not more or less, just differently. And he felt guilty about it every single day. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the envelope she'd been holding earlier. He wrote me a letter too, she said. His last words to me. Would you like to know what he said about you? Julian nodded, unable to speak. Yoko opened the envelope and read, If something happens to me, take care of Julian. Make sure he knows he mattered. Make sure he knows I was trying to be better. Don't let him think he was forgotten. The room fell silent again. I failed him in that, Yoko said. I should have called you immediately. Should have invited you to say goodbye. I was so lost in my own grief that I forgot you were grieving too. Julian stood in the middle of that white room, surrounded by his father's friends, holding a letter that had arrived too late. I didn't come here to make anyone feel bad, he said finally. I came because I needed to say goodbye, because the world got to mourn him publicly, but I had to do it alone in my room in England, watching the news coverage like a stranger. He looked around at the faces watching him. You all knew him. The New York John, the house husband John, the John who baked bread and raised Sean and found peace. His voice hardened. I knew a different John, the one who left, the one who forgot, the one who said he'd be better and then disappeared for years at a time. Julian, someone started to interject. Let me finish, Julian cut them off. I'm not saying this to hurt anyone. I'm saying it because it's true, and pretending otherwise doesn't honor him. It just makes his death another lie in a life full of them. He pulled the letter out again, holding it up. This letter? It's everything I wanted to hear when he was alive. Every word I needed him to say. And he finally said them. Julian's voice broke. 3 days too late. The pain in his voice was unbearable. He knew he was wrong. He knew he'd failed me. And he wrote it all down. But he never picked up the phone, never got on a plane, never did the one thing that mattered. Show up, Yoko spoke quietly. He was going to. He was planning a trip to England in January. He wanted to spend your 18th birthday with you. But he didn't live that long. No. Julian looked at the photograph of his father, John in his New York City shirt, smiling at the camera with that sharp, intelligent gaze. I came here to tell him something, Julian said, and even though he's not here to hear it, I'm going to say it anyway. He took a deep breath. I forgive you, Dad. The words fell like stones into still water. I forgive you for leaving, for forgetting, for choosing your new life over me. I forgive you for being human and flawed and fucked up. I forgive you for being the kind of father your father was to you." Tears were streaming down Julian's face now. "But I also need to say this. It wasn't okay. What you did wasn't okay. And this letter, as beautiful as it is, doesn't erase the years you missed. Doesn't bring back the birthdays or the Christmases or the nights I waited for you to call, and you never did." He looked at Yoko. "He asked me to not blame you, and I don't. I blame him. For his choices, for his cowardice, for all the ways he let his trauma win." Julian walked closer to the photograph. "But I also want to thank you, because in those last few years, you tried. After that day in the therapy office in '74, you actually tried. You called, you visited, you taught me guitar, you wrote me that song." His voice softened. "You showed me that people can change, that it's never too late to try to be better, even if you run out of time before you fully succeed." Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like. That helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. After Julian finished speaking, nobody moved for a long moment. Then Bob Gruen, the photographer, stood up. "I need to say something," he said quietly. "I photographed John for years, captured him in his most private moments. And you're right, Julian. He talked about you constantly, especially these last few months." He pulled out his camera bag and removed a contact sheet. "These are from October, 6 weeks before he died. He didn't know I was photographing him." Bob handed the contact sheet to Julian. It showed John sitting at his piano, looking at something in his hands. In frame after frame, John's face showed different emotions: sadness, regret, something close to grief. "He was looking at a photograph," Bob explained, "of you, from when you were little. He kept it in the piano bench, and sometimes, when he thought nobody was watching, he'd take it out and just stare at it." Julian studied the contact sheet, seeing his father's private grief captured in black and white. "He told me once," Bob continued, "that his biggest fear wasn't death. It was dying before he could make things right with you." The words landed heavy in the room. Elliot Mintz spoke next. "John called me 3 days before he died, December 5th. He was agitated, said he needed to do something important, but kept putting it off because he was scared." "Scared of what?" Julian asked. "Scared you'd reject him. Scared you'd tell him it was too late. Scared that even if he tried, he couldn't undo the damage." Elliot looked at Julian directly. "He was going to call you that weekend, December 13th. Your 18th birthday was coming up, and he wanted to ask if he could come visit, if you'd give him another chance." Julian's breath caught. He was going to call? He never got the chance. Another person spoke up, a woman Julian didn't recognize. "I'm Dr. Linda Kaplan," she said. "I was John's therapist these last 2 years. He talked about you in almost every session." "He was still in therapy?" Julian was surprised. "Yes, he never stopped trying to understand why he did the things he did, why he ran, why he couldn't be the father he wanted to be." Dr. Kaplan pulled out a small notebook. "He gave me permission to share this with you if anything ever happened to him. These are his words from our last session. November 30th. She began reading. "I look at Sean, and I see all the things I should have done with Julian. Every birthday party, every bedtime story, every stupid little moment that builds a relationship. And I'm grateful I'm getting it right this time. But that gratitude is mixed with crushing guilt because Julian deserved this version of me. He deserved the father who shows up." Julian closed his eyes. overwhelmed. Dr. Kaplan continued, "Sometimes I dream that I can go back, that I can redo Julian's childhood with the wisdom I have now. But that's not how life works. You don't get do-overs. You only get now. And the question is, what do I do with now? How do I make up for 10 years of absence?" She closed the notebook. He didn't know the answer to that question, but he was trying to find one. Julian opened his eyes. Did he love me? It was the same question he'd asked his father 6 years earlier in that therapy office in Los Angeles. Dr. Kaplan didn't hesitate. Yes, without question, but his love was complicated by guilt and shame and all the trauma he carried. He loved you in a broken way, but he was working on unbreaking himself. He ran out of time, Julian said flatly. Yes, he did. Yoko had been silent through all of this, but now she spoke. "There's something else you should know," she said to Julian. "John changed his will 2 months ago. I found out after he died." Julian looked at her warily. "What do you mean?" "He left you the apartment. This apartment, the Dakota." Everyone in the room looked shocked. "He did what?" Julian couldn't process this. "He said it was your inheritance, your piece of him. He wanted you to have the place where he finally found peace, where he became the person he always wanted to be." Julian shook his head. "I don't want his apartment. I wanted my father." "I know, but this was his way of saying you mattered, that you were his family, that you deserved something real and tangible, not just words in a letter." "He should have just called me," Julian said, his voice breaking again. "He should have picked up the phone instead of changing his will." "You're right," Yoko agreed. "He should have, but he was scared, and sometimes scared people do grand gestures instead of simple ones." Julian looked around the room at all these people who'd known his father in ways he never would. "Tell me about him," he said suddenly. "Tell me who he was these last few years. I want to know the father I missed." What happened next was something nobody had planned. One by one, the mourners in that room began sharing stories about John Lennon. Not the legend, not the Beatle, just John, the man who was trying to be better. Bob Gruen went first. He baked bread every morning, obsessively. He said the routine helped him stay grounded, kept him from disappearing into his head too much. He smiled sadly. Sometimes the bread would burn because he'd get distracted playing with Sean, and he'd laugh about it, say that even his bread was rock and roll, a little burnt, a little imperfect, but still good. Someone else spoke up, a neighbor from the Dakota. He walked Sean to school every day, rain or shine, and he'd stop and talk to everyone. The doorman, the homeless guy on the corner, the old lady who fed pigeons. He treated everyone the same, like they mattered. Elliot Mintz shared, he called his mother's sister Mimi every week, his aunt who raised him. They'd talk for hours. He was trying to understand his childhood, trying to forgive her for being cold and strict, trying to make peace with his past. Dr. Kaplan added, he cried in almost every therapy session. He wasn't ashamed of it. He said crying was proof he was still human, that fame hadn't completely destroyed his ability to feel. The stories continued. John playing piano at 3 a.m. when he couldn't sleep. John writing postcards to old friends he'd lost touch with. John watching Sean sleep and crying because he'd missed watching Julian do the same. John volunteering at a food bank anonymously because he wanted to do something real, something that mattered beyond music. John calling Cynthia and apologizing for how he'd treated her during their marriage. John trying, always trying. Never quite succeeding, but never giving up either. Julian listened to all of it, building a picture of his father he'd never had access to. The John who'd left him wasn't the same John who died. People change, sometimes too late, but they change. Finally, Yoko spoke. "He loved you in a way he couldn't articulate," she said to Julian. "Every time he looked at Sean, he thought of you. Every milestone with Sean was colored by the milestones he'd missed with you." She stood up and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a wooden box. "These are for you. He's been collecting them for years." She handed the box to Julian. Inside were dozens of newspaper clippings, articles about Julian's life, his school achievements, a review of a small concert he'd performed at in Liverpool, a photograph from Cynthia's wedding to her second husband, where Julian stood in the background. John had been keeping track, silently, from a distance, but watching. He couldn't always show up, Yoko said, but he was paying attention. Julian pulled out a clipping from 1977, a local newspaper article about Julian winning a science fair. On the back, in John's handwriting, "My son, my brilliant son. God, I wish I'd been there." Julian's hands shook as he went through the box. Every clipping had a note on the back. Missed another birthday. 15 years old. Where did the time go? He looked so much like me at that age. Same angry eyes. I put that anger there. Saw him on the street today in London. Didn't have the courage to say hello. I'm a coward. He's taller than me now. When did that happen? Each note was a confession, a moment of private grief. Proof that John hadn't forgotten, even when he'd failed to act. Julian read every single one. By the time he finished, he was crying so hard he couldn't breathe. These people, strangers an hour ago, gathered around him. They didn't offer empty platitudes. They just sat with him in his grief. Finally, Julian spoke through his tears. I hate him for dying. I hate him for running out of time. I hate him for finally becoming the person I needed when it was too late for it to matter. Nobody tried to contradict him. But I also love him, despite everything. I love the man he was trying to become. I love the father he wanted to be, even if he never quite got there. Julian looked at Yoko. Can I stay here tonight, in his apartment? I want to feel close to him. Yoko nodded. Of course, stay as long as you need. That night, after everyone else had left, Julian sat alone in his father's apartment. Yoko had gone to her bedroom. Sean was staying with his aunt. The Dakota was silent, except for the sound of New York City outside the windows. Julian walked through the rooms his father had occupied. The bedroom where John had written his final songs, the kitchen where he'd burned that bread, the nursery where he'd raised Sean, and finally the music room. The white piano sat in the corner, exactly as John had left it. Sheet music scattered across the top, a half-finished coffee cup leaving a ring on the wood. Julian sat down at the piano. He hadn't played much since his father had taught him in 1974. Life had gotten in the way. School, friends, the normal concerns of growing up. But the muscle memory was still there. He placed his hands on the keys and began playing the C chord his father had taught him 6 years earlier. Then he started playing a melody. Nothing fancy, just something simple and sad. And then he began to sing. Not his father's words, his own. A song about loving someone who never quite shows up. About forgiving someone who dies before you can tell them. About carrying the weight of someone else's regrets. He sang until his voice gave out. He sang until the sun started rising over Central Park. He sang his grief and his anger and his love all mixed together. When he finally stopped, he realized someone was standing in the doorway. Yoko, she'd been listening. That was beautiful, she said quietly. I didn't know I could write songs, Julian admitted. You're John's son. Of course you can write songs. Julian looked at her. Did he know that I might want to be a musician? He hoped, but he didn't want to pressure you. He said you should choose your own path, not feel obligated to follow his. That's almost funny, Julian said, considering he pressured me about everything except the one thing he actually knew about. Yoko came into the room and sat down beside Julian at the piano. He was complicated, impossible sometimes, but he was trying to break cycles, trying to be different than his parents were. Did he succeed? Yoko thought about this. Partially. He was better than they were, but not as good as he wanted to be. Somewhere in the middle, which is probably the most human thing about him. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Yoko said, I know you probably hate me. Everyone does. The woman who stole John Lennon. Julian surprised himself by saying, "I don't hate you. I did once. But reading his letter, hearing these stories, I realize now that you didn't steal him. He chose you, and that's not your fault." "He chose you too," Yoko said, in his own broken way. "He just didn't know how to show it properly." "No, he didn't." Yoko stood up. "The apartment is yours. He wanted you to have it. But I need to ask you something." "What?" "Don't sell it immediately. Live here for a while. Get to know your father through the space he occupied. And then, when you're ready, decide what to do with it." Julian looked around the white room. His father's room. His father's life. "Okay," he agreed. "I'll stay." "And Julian, the box of newspaper clippings? That's not everything. There are journals too, letters he wrote but never sent, recordings of him talking about you in therapy. Your father documented his guilt obsessively. It's all here. It's all yours. Why are you giving me this? Because he wanted you to understand. He wanted you to know that even when he was absent, you were on his mind. Always." 3 months later, Julian was still living at the Dakota. He'd read every journal entry, listened to every therapy recording, gone through every unsent letter, and he'd learned things about his father he'd never known. How John had watched Julian's building in Liverpool from across the street multiple times, too scared to knock on the door. How John had almost shown up to Julian's 16th birthday, but turned around at the last minute because he didn't think he'd be welcome. How John had cried after every phone call with Julian, convinced he was failing as a father, but unsure how to do better. The evidence of love was overwhelming. Broken love, cowardly love, love that didn't know how to show up properly, but love nonetheless. Julian had also continued writing songs. The music room had become his space. He wrote about his father, about loss, about complicated families and imperfect people. One afternoon in March, Julian sat down and wrote a letter back to his father. He didn't know why. John would never read it, but he needed to write it anyway. "Dear Dad, I got your letter. 3 days too late, but I got it. Thank you for finally saying the things I needed to hear. Thank you for admitting you messed up. Thank you for loving me in the only way you knew how. I forgive you. I need you to know that, wherever you are. I forgive you for leaving, for disappearing, for being human and flawed and scared. But I also need you to know that it hurt. God, it hurts so much. Growing up knowing my father was John Lennon, but not knowing John Lennon. Watching the world love you while feeling invisible to you. I read your journals, all of them. I know now that you thought about me constantly, that you regretted your choices, that you wanted to be better, but didn't know how. And here's what I realized. You did the best you could with the tools you had. Your mother abandoned you. Your father left. You were raised by a woman who didn't know how to show affection, and somehow, despite all that trauma, you still tried to love me. You failed. A lot. But you tried. And that has to count for something. I'm living in your apartment now. Yoko gave it to me like you wanted. I sit at your piano and play the chords you taught me. I walk through Central Park and think about how you used to walk here with Sean. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can feel you here. Not as a ghost or anything supernatural, but as a presence. A reminder that I'm your son and you're my father, and that connection exists even if you're gone. I'm going to make music, Dad. I'm going to write songs. Not because you were a musician, but because I discovered I love it. That it helps me process things I can't say out loud. And maybe that's your gift to me. Not your fame or your legacy or your apartment, but the understanding that music can heal, that creating something can help you survive impossible pain. You weren't a great father. Let's be honest about that. But you were my father. And in those final years, you were trying. You were becoming someone better. You just ran out of time. But here's what I want you to know. I'm okay. I'm going to be okay. You don't have to worry about me anymore. I'm stronger than you were. I'm going to break the cycles you couldn't break. I'm going to be the father you wanted to be if I ever have kids. Not because you taught me how, but because you taught me how not to. And maybe that's enough. I love you, Dad. I wish you were here. I wish I could tell you this in person. I wish we had more time. But we don't. So I'm writing this letter into the void and hoping somehow you hear it. Thank you for trying. Thank you for failing. Thank you for being complicated and human and real. Thank you for being my father, even when you didn't know how. I miss you. Love, Julian. Julian folded the letter carefully and placed it in the piano bench, right where his father used to keep Julian's childhood photograph. Then he sat down and played. He played the song he'd been writing for 3 months. A song about fathers and sons and the space between love and presence. A song about forgiveness and grief and moving forward. A song that would eventually become his first single. The song was called Too Late for Goodbyes. And though Julian didn't know it yet, it would reach number 5 on the charts. Critics would compare his voice to his father's. Fans would analyze the lyrics for hidden meanings about John Lennon. But Julian knew the truth. The song wasn't about being too late. It was about saying goodbye anyway. It was about finding peace with imperfect love. It was about understanding that sometimes the most important conversations happen after someone is gone. That day at the funeral that wasn't a funeral, when Julian appeared unannounced with his father's letter, he'd been devastated. But 3 months later, sitting at his father's piano in his father's apartment, Julian realized something. His father had given him a gift. Not the apartment, not the money, not the famous last name, but the permission to be human, to fail, to try anyway. To love imperfectly, to forgive incompletely, to be complicated and real and messy. John Lennon wasn't a perfect father, but his imperfect love had taught Julian something important. You don't have to be perfect to matter. You don't have to get everything right to be worthy of forgiveness. You just have to try. And when you can't try anymore, you hope that the people you love understand. Julian understood now. And though his father was gone, that understanding felt like a kind of presence, a connection that death couldn't break. That funeral in December had devastated everyone who heard John's letter. But it had also freed Julian, freed him to grieve honestly, to love honestly, to remember his father honestly, not as a legend or an icon or a villain, but as a man who tried and failed and tried again, as a father who loved his son even when he didn't know how to show it, as John, just John. And sometimes that's enough. If this story of complicated love, impossible grief, and the power of forgiveness moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear that perfect love doesn't exist, but real love does. That it's never too late to say what needs to be said, even to someone who's gone. Have you ever had to forgive someone who wasn't there to receive it? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more untold stories about the messy, beautiful reality of being human.